Professor Young, I hope you weren't brought here this morning just in case, and if you were, and I apologise for keeping you waiting.
Not at all.
If you repeat after me, I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but
and nothing but the truth.
Can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
Ian Stuart Young.
And I think, Professor Stewart, you ought to have a witness statement in front of you, which you signed on the 31st of January of this year.
Yes.
And are you content that that witness statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Thank you. Professor Young, I wanted to start, if I may, by asking you some questions about your background. You're obviously here to give evidence because you were the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Department of Health. But prior to 2020, I think that it's right that you held that role in conjunction with a number of other positions, or you had a number of other professional roles. Is that correct?
That is correct, and I do continue to hold other roles, as the CSA role is a part-time role within Northern Ireland.
So I think it's right that prior to the pandemic, the commitment was for 3 days a week. Is that right?
Yes, the commitment was for the equivalent of 3 days per week, worked in a flexible way.
And I think it's also right that you were a professor of medicine at Queen's University as well. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And did you have a particular specialisation as a professor?
Yes, my interests are in laboratory medicine and nutrition, both in relation to my academic work and also clinically, because I had a clinical job as a medical professional within Belfast Health and Social Care Trust.
And is it right that that role was one of a clinical pathologist then?
Technically a chemical pathologist, which is one of the branches of pathology.
And what you explain in your witness statement was that prior to 2020, a principal focus of the Chief Scientific Advisor's work was that of research and development. Is that correct?
Yes, there are three aspects to the role of the CSA. One is as Director of Research and Development for Health and Social Care in Northern Ireland, and that was the component of the job which occupied the greater part of my CSA commitment. The other two aspects of the job are as Head of Profession for the Healthcare Science workforce, which constitutes over 2,500 healthcare scientists in Northern Ireland, working in over 50 separate disciplines. And the third aspect of the job was to provide scientific advice.
And would it be correct in terms of the specialisation that you brought to the role of CSA? Is that better seen as being clinical expertise, or is it better categorised as scientific expertise, or is there no real difference between the two?
No, it was very much scientific expertise. As well as being medically qualified, I have a basic science degree. And whenever the CSO role was advertised, it was open either to medically qualified or scientifically qualified candidates. I was appointed, I think, based on my scientific credentials rather than my medical credentials. So medical advice within the context of the department came very much from the CMO and deputy CMOs. My role was to provide scientific advice.
And I think it's right to say as well that your role was specific to the Department of Health rather than being a cross-departmental role. Is that also right?
That is correct, yes. My role was specifically and exclusively within the Department of Health.
And you explain in your witness statement, and I'm sure this will be clear as we consider your evidence as well, that you worked very closely with the CMO. Is that correct?
I worked very closely with the CMO, particularly during the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, I was largely independent, but reported to the CMO. and met with him on a reasonably regular basis. But during the pandemic, we worked together very closely.
All right, and I should have made that distinction clear, because when the pandemic started and when you came back to your post in March of 2020, I think it's right that at that point in time it then became a full-time post. Is that correct?
Yes, it became the equivalent of a full-time post, I think, is what I've said, meaning significantly over 40 hours per week, often much, much more than that. But in fact, I continued to do my clinical work in the hospital throughout the pandemic, and also some academic work at times.
All right. And just in terms of your working relationship with the CMO, I think it's right, you took up your CSA position in 2015.
Yes.
That's right. And did you overlap with the CMO in other professional roles, or was it only in your capacity of CSA that you had overlapped with him or did overlap?
The CMO is ultimately responsible for all medical professionals within Northern Ireland. So in that sense,
yes,
I overlap with them. But in relation to the department, it was purely around scientific advice, the CSA role, and research and development, as I have described.
All right. So Professor Young, just returning then to the first few months of 2020, I know that you set out in your statement that you went on leave in or around the 12th of February, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
But what you say is that you didn't play any part in the response to the pandemic up and until that point, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
So I think there had been a number of developments in the Department of Health in January. I think, for example, it had an emergency operating centre that was operational from January. And we know that COBRA was on foot from the 24th of January. And we know, for example, that Sir Patrick Vallance, who's the UK Chief Scientific Advisor, attended COBRA from the outset. Was there a reason why you hadn't been integrated into that part of the Department of Health response at that early stage?
I guess that's a question that would need to be directed to others rather than to me. I can observe that I wasn't integrated into the response at that stage. I was aware of the emerging pandemic from other areas of my professional life in particular, and my understanding was that the lead in terms of response was coming from CMO and other colleagues within the Department of Health, and my expectation was that I would be called on to provide scientific input whenever they felt that was necessary. And with that in mind, I was doing my best to keep up with scientific developments in the wider literature.
And why didn't you put yourself forward at that time and say that the CSA ought to be part of the response in January until mid-February?
Well, my experience of working in the department was that I was available for advice in a large number of areas. There were a number of areas where I had been called on to give advice, for example, around obesity, alcohol, rare diseases, genomics. So, and policy colleagues would call me in when they felt it was necessary to have additional scientific input beyond what they were obtaining already from other sources. I recall having some general discussions, at least with some of my DA equivalents, and I think their involvement at that early stage was also very patchy. So the expectation was that we might be called on at a later stage.
I just want to focus on you, if I may, rather than other colleagues in other administrations. I mean, would it be correct to say then that at that early stage in the pandemic, you didn't see a role for yourself within the response? Rather, you were waiting, I think, as you've explained, to be called upon?
I think that's correct, yes.
I just appreciate Ms. Dobbins said don't talk about other jurisdictions. Can I just ask this question? Other jurisdictions, you have a chief scientific officer as well as scientific officers for individual departments. When you're talking about colleagues, are you talking about colleagues who were chief scientific officers for their jurisdiction or who were scientific officers for a particular department?
So I'm talking about the chief scientific advisors for the...
Did I say officers? Sorry, advisors.
That's okay. The chief scientific advisors for the departments of health,
Right.
specifically in Wales and Scotland, which I viewed as my equivalents.
Thank you.
Thank you, my lady. So, Professor Young, just coming back then to you, you've set out in your witness statement that you returned to your post on the 23rd of March, having been on leave. And obviously a number of things had taken place in your absence. And I think by that stage, COVID was well established in Northern Ireland, wasn't it? Test and trace had been stopped in Northern Ireland on the 12th of March.
Yes.
That's right. There had been the announcement to work from home on the 16th of March in Northern Ireland.
Yes.
School closures had been announced on the 18th of March to become effective on the 23rd of March, I think. Is that also
Well, I haven't got that document in front of me, but yes, that
Well,
seems
I think
reasonable.
you can take it from me. That's
Yes.
not controversial. And on the 22nd of March, there'd been an announcement of the 2-metre rule. Do you recollect that?
I couldn't give you the exact
Okay.
dates.
Well,
but
don't worry.
yes.
I don't think any of that's controversial. But in any event, obviously, a number of very significant decisions had taken place in your absence. There obviously wasn't a CSA in post during that period of time. Do you understand why no one had stepped in to take that position during those very important stages of the response?
So within the department, there wasn't any deputy to my position. So there, I think, wasn't anyone obvious within the department to step up. But my understanding would be that other colleagues, mainly medically qualified colleagues, would have been stepping in to fill the gaps, and that in addition, scientific input or information to the Department of Health would have been coming via UK-wide sources.
All right.
But yes, I recognise that there was a gap.
I mean, I think the important point, Professor Young, is that we know that it wasn't until you came back that a number of important parts of the response were instituted. For example, it was only when you came back, and I think you drove this, that there was any modelling capacity in Northern Ireland. Is that correct?
So the week before I returned to work, I contacted the CMO and had a conversation with him about what he felt would be the most important things that I could do on my return to work. And establishing modelling capacity was, I think, the thing that was top of the list at that stage, although obviously there were a number of other things which were also important and which I looked to take ahead.
And again, why was that contingent upon you being in position? Was that because there weren't other obvious candidates to be able to take that work forward?
So I think I can't answer that, obviously, and again, it's a question that would need to be better addressed by someone else. Certainly, I thought that the amount of data which was available close to my return even was extremely limited in Northern Ireland. And in terms of effective modelling, the key to it is having effective data inputs to allow the modellers to work. I think it would have been possible to do some modelling before my return to work, but that there would have been considerable uncertainties around that, even greater uncertainties than the initial modelling, which we did due to the greatly limited data inputs.
Right. I'm going to come back to the limited data, if I may, shortly. I think it's also right that in your absence, there wasn't anyone who had membership of SAGE in Northern Ireland. Is that correct?
So that is correct. And again, I think that there were observers from Northern Ireland, is my understanding, at the majority of the SAGE meetings, if not all, and that the outputs and minutes from SAGE meetings were being received by the CMO. But following my return to work, I wrote to SAGE Secretariat and asked that I join as a full member of SAGE.
And just in terms of the suggestion that someone from Northern Ireland was attending as an observer, it may be that these exist. I don't think we've seen, for example, any notes being provided as to what had been discussed or the nuance of any of the debate at SAGE meetings. Was anyone actually formally reporting back on what was being said at SAGE?
So I know that there are some notes or readouts from SAGE meetings which were provided by observers because in terms of preparing for this inquiry, I've certainly seen some examples of those. I can't speak to how comprehensive they were. The SAGE minutes, as you'll realise, unfortunately do not record for early meetings all of those who were present. In particular, yes, they don't record the observers who were present. So in terms of Northern Ireland attendance, I understand an effort has been made to reconstruct who was present as an observer for those meetings and that information is available.
Right.
But I don't think observer status is as useful as full member and participant status at SAGE meetings.
Yes. So I think what you say in your statement was it was only by being a member, obviously, that you could actually take part in the debates or put forward, for example, a Northern Irish perspective on what was being discussed. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And I think what's also right is that there wasn't a body or an advisory body who were synthesising information coming out of SAGE for the purposes of a Northern Irish audience either. That was something that you instituted when you came back as well.
Yes, that's also correct.
And I think it is right that the CMO says that he received papers back from SAGE, but one imagines, given the pressures that he was under as well, the ability of a group of advisors to synthesise that and provide best information, and from other sources as well, must be quite important.
Certainly that became increasingly important as the pandemic progressed and the volume of papers and length of papers being considered by SAGE increased. So yes, I think being able to synthesise that and provide summary, condensed information or advice, and then any detail that was necessary to help inform CMO's advice was important.
And again, can you explain why that wasn't set up until you were back in your post? And I think it was the 27th of March, perhaps, when the first meeting of that group took place.
In terms of the Strategic Intelligence Group, it was
yes,
actually the 27th of April, I think, the
Sorry,
first
forgive
meeting,
me, that's what I meant.
rather
yes,
than the 27th of March before that took place. And I think certainly whenever I returned to work, I was meant to be returning on a phased return to work. That didn't happen. I was working very extended hours, 7 days a week, and there was a lot to get up to speed with and a lot of information to synthesise. So it was towards middle end of April before I got round to establishing a broader group of experts to help with the work of analysing SAGE and other scientific inputs in the context of Northern Ireland.
But again, that sounds as though that was being very much driven by you, as opposed to being part of an institutional response to the structures that existed in the United Kingdom.
In terms of establishing our own scientific advisory group, yes, that was an internal Northern Ireland decision,
yes,
rather than part of a UK structure, and it was driven by the CMO and myself.
Yes. Again, just trying to understand why that hadn't taken place at an earlier point, or why it wasn't instigated until you came back. What was the reason for that?
Well, Again, it's a question probably better directed to others, but I suspect it was to do with the very small number of individuals in the Department of Health covering a much larger number of areas than is the case for the other administrations in the UK. People were just under so much pressure with so much to do that it was impossible to address absolutely everything.
So even though it's something that would have assisted them, those very few people with all of those responsibilities, it was just a question of not having the capacity to set that sort of structure up.
I think, as I said, it's a question best directed to others, but, you know, I suspect that that was absolutely one of the reasons.
All right, and the other point that you address in your witness statement was that in terms of the Chief Scientific Advisors network that existed within the United Kingdom, that was restricted to membership of one scientific advisor to Northern Ireland, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. After I took up post in 2015, I requested to join that scientific network. That was declined by the UK government CSA, and it was explained that they would allow one Northern Ireland CSA to attend. Northern Ireland does not have a cross-government CSA, as is present in Wales, Scotland, or Patrick Vallance in the case of London. There is just myself and CSA in Dara, who cover agriculture and here. And it was agreed that the Dara CSA, whose appointment was full-time and who had been in post longer than me, would be a Northern Ireland link to the CSA network. However, again, I think that was not any substitute for being able to participate in the network, as all of the London departmental CSAs, for example, are able to.
And in terms of during the pandemic itself, did that remain the position that you weren't able to attend that group?
It did. During the pandemic, it was probably less important because SAGE was driving the scientific response to the pandemic rather than it being driven through the CSA network. But certainly that remains the case to today, that it's not possible for me to be a member of the CSA network.
All right. Professor Young, I want to move on, if I may, then, just to ask you about some of the statistics in Northern Ireland. And I was going to take you to one of the slides that was shown at the outset of Module 2C starting. So this is INQ 000472397. This slide, and I think it's a slide that you might be familiar with, and provides a broad picture as to how the pandemic progressed in Northern Ireland. And I just wanted to establish if we had common ground with you, Professor Young. So the first part of the graph, that shows effectively the first wave, doesn't it, or the first spike, and that we see from January onwards, but peaking in the April time, is that right?
Yes, and just before we go through this, just to make a preliminary comment. So I think the shape of the pandemic is essentially the same with three waves, but the relative size of the peaks in the pandemic varies greatly depending on whether you look at deaths,
yes,
or ICU occupancy, or hospital occupancy, or cases. And I'm happy to explore the reasons for that, but this graph shows the shape of the pandemic in terms of deaths.
Yes.
And it would be different if we looked at some other parameters, although still having those same three waves.
Well, I mean, obviously, deaths is one of the most important means by which to measure a response to a pandemic. Do you agree?
Absolutely, yes.
And if we look then at what this shows, it suggests obviously the first peak was, although the peak was high, it was for a much shorter period of time, wasn't it?
Yes, it was a relatively short and sharp initial wave, yes.
And then it levelled off after July 2020, and then we see it start to pick up again. And I think I'd be assisted if you can help. Do we see that the growth, the initial growth, when it starts to ascend quite sharply, is that in and around the September time of 2020, or is it earlier than that?
So in terms of deaths, it would be towards the end of September. But in terms of following the progress of the pandemic, deaths are the end stage
Yes.
of a process which starts with a case. So they are a lagging marker of the progression. And if we were to look at cases, we would see them rising certainly from the beginning of August
Yes.
2020.
That's obviously really important, Professor Young, and I'm going to come back to that just to understand what happened. And can you just help us then generally with what the lag is in Northern Ireland between case numbers rising and deaths rising?
So the lag is something which was observed everywhere and was largely the same. It did change a little bit during different phases of the pandemic, but essentially cases occurring through to risk of hospital admission was about 10 days.
Yes.
And then obviously hospital admissions would be rising around 10 days afterwards. And then deaths tended to have a much longer window, unfortunately, so would be anything from 5 days to quite a long time after admission to hospital.
All right, we're going to come back and look at that in much more detail in terms of what happened in December. But I think it's right then when we look at I'm calling it the second wave, but looking at that much longer period leading up to January 2021 and thereafter. Is it right to effectively characterise this as a single wave, but a much longer wave in time than the first wave?
Yes, and we would have described that at the time as wave 2,
Yes.
peaking in January 21.
But I think it's also probably important, and obviously the point about January 2021 is important, but nonetheless the rate of deaths was going up at quite a sharp ascent right up until that period of time, wasn't it?
There was a difficult plateau in the autumn months of 20, really from October onwards, with a relatively high rate of deaths, unfortunately, rising and falling a little bit, and then rising to a significantly higher peak in January 21.
Yes. We'll come back to that, but I just wanted to make sure that we were in broad agreement in terms of how it looks, because I think it will be important when we look at what happened in the autumn. Thank you, that can come down. I also wanted to check whether or not you agree, Professor Young, with the evidence that Professor Hale has given to the inquiry, that effectively when we look at the first wave of the pandemic in Northern Ireland, the decision to go into a national lockdown was at an earlier stage in the development of the pandemic in Northern Ireland as compared, for example, to England.
Yes, I do agree with that.
And I think that brings us neatly back to you coming back into post on the 23rd of March, which was the day that was announced. When you came back, did you understand that was essentially a fait accompli, that was what was going to happen, or was that a matter of discussion within the Department of Health?
So whenever I came back, I felt that it was inevitable that there needed to be severe, strong non-pharmaceutical interventions, effectively lockdown as we came to refer to it. and that there was no alternative at that stage. I can't remember whether it was still a matter of discussion or not immediately when I came back to work, because I was not initially part of those discussions. I was focused on establishing the modelling group and integrating with UK scientific networks, etc. But certainly when I came back, I was of the view that that was the only possible intervention or outcome which could take place.
All right. And was that because you were confident that the spread in Northern Ireland had reached such a level that it was the only step that could be taken so as not to overwhelm health services?
Yes, that was my view at the time. And I'm sure we may return to this, but there was extremely limited testing capacity available at that point. So really very little evidence on which to estimate the actual prevalence of the virus in the community, as we got very good at doing later in the pandemic. But certainly my view at that time is that there was relatively wide community transmission already taking place. We just weren't able to detect it due to lack of testing capacity, and therefore the only intervention in the absence of testing to prevent it was effectively a lockdown.
And just in terms of why you were confident that that was the position despite the lack of testing, was that because of the numbers of people who were arriving at hospital, or was it a sort of scientific assessment on your part that if it looks like that in England and it looks like that in the Republic of Ireland, I don't know if that was the case, but if it looks like that in those jurisdictions, that's probably what it's like in Northern Ireland?
So it was looking like that everywhere in Europe. And, obviously there was somewhat larger number of cases that had been reported in England, some cases in the Republic of Ireland. But given the trajectory of the pandemic in Europe, particularly North Italy, it was inconceivable to me that it would do anything else other than proceed in a similar way in Northern Ireland, unless there was some very strong intervention. So it was a scientific assessment rather than a data-driven assessment.
That's a much neater way of putting it. Thank you. And just in terms of, I want to just stay on the issue of the physical island of Ireland. We know that an MOU was entered into between I think it was in fact the Department of Health in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and that it foresaw, and I'm going to summarise it, there would be a high degree of cooperation effectively between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And specifically it foresaw that there would be cooperation on modelling. And there's just a few things about that I wanted to ask you. First of all, is it your position that, as a matter of epidemiology, that the whole island was effectively one unit and that the virus was behaving in that way within the island?
Yes, I agree that Ireland was a single epidemiological unit, and in my opinion, the epidemic proceeded in a broadly similar way across the island of Ireland. But I think that's only a partial truth, because as well as that, the islands of Great Britain and Ireland were a single epidemiological unit due to the existence of the common travel area.
Yes.
And therefore, the epidemic was also proceeding as one entity across the islands of Great Britain and Ireland. So there was something separate about Ireland as a single epidemiological unit, but it couldn't be considered in isolation from Great Britain due to the existence of the common travel area.
All right, so just if we may stick on Ireland just for a moment. The MOU obviously foresaw that there would be a value in having cooperation about modelling, but we know that that wasn't ultimately possible in terms of having joint modelling. Is that correct?
I think that's correct, and the reason it wasn't possible is that it wouldn't have been meaningful due to the existence of considerable differences in terms of data collection and recording. And if we take the example of deaths, as that is what we were looking at in terms of the preceding graph, within Northern Ireland, deaths are recorded within 7 days and reported. Within the Republic of Ireland, it's not necessary to report deaths for up to 3 months. So given those sorts of differences in terms of how deaths are reported and recorded, it becomes impossible to do any meaningful modelling with such different data flows. So I did have quite extensive conversations and discussions with modelling colleagues in the Republic of Ireland to explore options. We certainly shared data and outputs. I think there were occasions when we used our models on the Republic of Ireland and occasions when they looked at our data with their models. But to combine the data, given the differences in it, would not have been meaningful or helpful. Indeed, it might have been misleading to one or both of us.
But would it have been useful if it had have been possible?
I think it would have been useful if the intention was to make similar policy decisions. Where there were different policy decisions across the two jurisdictions, it would have been less useful. And that's obviously a matter of politics. I mean, I've said that I viewed Ireland as a single epidemiological unit, which I did. I note that SPIM and its modelling groups very quickly began not to do UK modelling, but to report modelling for England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. For much the same, in other words, they didn't think that combined UK modelling would be particularly useful, something I agreed with for other reasons. And also, in fact, the gap between Northern Ireland and Scotland is less than the gap between the North and South Islands of New Zealand. And New Zealand worked very well as a single epidemiological unit, in many ways set an interesting example because there were similar policy decisions governing the entire country of New Zealand and both the North and South Islands. So in terms of the modelling, we could have done it, but there were so many limitations that certainly my view was, and I think the view of many others, that it wouldn't have been useful.
But just in terms of understanding why it wouldn't be useful to know what was happening in Ireland in order to inform future policy choices, there's obviously a distinction between the two things. Why is it not useful to know epidemiologically what's happening in one part of an island in order to inform what might happen in another part in a week's time, for example?
Well, I think we did know that and shared that information in the regular meetings which took place following the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding with the CMOs and deputy CMOs, and which I attended. And the Republic of Ireland didn't have a scientific advisor in the same sense, but where sometimes modellers and scientists from the Republic of Ireland attended. We each shared in detail what our modelling was showing for our part of the island and what was happening in terms of progress of the epidemic. So we tried to get the benefit of knowing what was happening from the modelling without the confounding of combining data streams that were not equivalent in unhelpful ways. It's a bit like you have a basket of fruit and you say, oh, there are 6 pieces of fruit in that basket, but actually there's 3 apples and 3 pears. And what you need to know are the number of apples and pears. It's not the number of pieces of fruit in the overall basket.
All right. And in terms of the cooperation that existed between officials, I was going to say at official level, but between counterparts, within departments at within Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Was that predicated upon pre-existing relationships and cooperation, or was that something that became established during the pandemic?
Prior to the pandemic, and I'm sure the CMO would speak to this, my understanding is that there were regular contacts and meetings between the CMOs. I can't speak to the content of those because I wasn't involved in them. My closest equivalent would have been, I think, Chief Scientist to the Irish government, who was also heavily involved in research and development, and I would have met regularly with him in the context of research and development. But to say there wasn't a chief scientific advisor in the same sense, so I had very limited contacts with other parts of the Irish government or Department of Health.
The other sequel, I suppose, to this point is that we're certainly, the inquiry is aware that it's still very difficult to compare outcomes in the Republic of Ireland to those in Northern Ireland. So obviously the problem about the 3-month lag ought not to be a problem when it comes to being able to compare this far down the line. First of all, is that right?
I think that the 3-month is a guideline. I think my understanding is that sometimes in terms of recording deaths, that the delay in the Republic of Ireland can be even rather greater than that. And indeed, I know they had a cyber attack which impacted in 21 on their deaths reporting system as well, and attention to which has been drawn by other international bodies seeking to make comparisons. I think ultimately it will and should be possible to make comparisons, and I think it will be important to do that. But at the moment, I'm not sure that the data is sufficiently reconciled to allow it to be done in a meaningful way.
Well, it's 2024. We're a considerable point past the pandemic ending. Are those kind of efforts to be able to make the data comparable ongoing in Northern Ireland?
So in terms of data available in Northern Ireland, there are a lot of efforts ongoing to make sure that our data is comparable and feeds are comparable to those in England, Scotland and Wales. And the way ideally that it would be aligned is that data from the Republic of Ireland would also be comparable to data through the UK. It would be difficult from our point of view to have complete alignment with everybody unless the other countries are committed to being aligned with each other, and that's above my head in terms of.
But it's obviously very striking that this far down the line, it's being suggested that it isn't possible to compare outcomes in the Republic of Ireland to those in the north of Ireland. And you've suggested that there are obstacles to that because some deaths might be registered longer than 3 months in the Republic of Ireland, and they've had, I think you've suggested they had some sort of data breach 3 years ago. So just coming back to trying to understand why it's still not possible now to compare outcomes in the Republic of Ireland to the north of Ireland, are efforts being made to overcome those, the difficulties to which you've referred?
I think it is possible to compare outcomes. The question isn't about whether it's possible to do it. I think the question is how valid those comparisons are. And that's a matter of considerable debate scientifically and in terms of epidemiology. Now, I think it's important that it should be done and that researchers should continue to look at it, because I think it's important that we maximise the learning that comes out of the pandemic in order to improve our responses to a future pandemic. And part of that has to be trying to understand what happened on the island of Ireland with all of its complexities in terms of policy decisions, demographics, population density, all of the other things that might influence outcomes in the north of Ireland versus the south of Ireland.
So those seem to be a different set of reasons why it might be complicated to compare the position in the Republic of Ireland to that in Northern Ireland. Is that right?
So I think there's a set of reasons which relate to the data that's available, how the data was collected and the data flows. So that's one set of reasons. The second set of reasons is how you would interpret any differences which might be found when you do an analysis. There are reasons, for example, why you might expect there to be a higher number of deaths from COVID in Northern Ireland than in the Republic of Ireland. For example, population density in Northern Ireland is significantly higher than in the Republic of Ireland, and we know that COVID outcomes tend to be worse in areas of higher population density. Secondly, although people argue about it, there's likely to be a higher degree of socioeconomic deprivation in the north of Ireland than in the Republic of Ireland, and we know that COVID outcomes are worse in areas with larger amounts of socioeconomic deprivation. Now, all of that would need to be factored into the comparison in terms of understanding it. I don't think it could be, differences could necessarily be attributed easily to policy differences. It would have to take into account that much wider range of factors.
But there's obviously a distinction between the bare statistics in terms of comparing numbers of deaths between the two jurisdictions and the reasons why deaths might be higher in Northern Ireland, correct?
Yes.
But in terms of the reliability of the statistics in terms of comparing, and again, I, of course, accept it's just a bare statistic, but is there a sufficiently reliable basis upon which to say that deaths were higher in one jurisdiction as compared to the other?
I'm not sure I have seen data which has achieved widespread agreement and in which people have been able to make such a comparison. I'll go back to what I said at the beginning, which is my view that the pandemic proceeded in a broadly similar way across the island of Ireland. And I believe that that will have been the case in terms of deaths ultimately, as in terms of other aspects of the pandemic. But I think more work needs to be done there to understand that and to provide unequivocal evidence.
I'm sure you're aware, but I think you addressed it in your witness statement, the academic criticism that's been made, I think, by Professor Heenan, that although there is cooperation at an operational level, that nonetheless there isn't, and she has, I think, described it as almost deliberate, that there isn't data available to be able to compare, and that that's almost a strategic decision in order to, I suppose, to stop inquiry into why there might be differences. I think that is something that you disagree with in your witness statement. Is that right?
I think what I've said is that I've absolutely never seen any evidence of that in my interaction, certainly in the Department of Health. Rather, I've seen a degree of enthusiasm for working as much as possible on an all-island basis and for looking to be able to conduct comparisons.
I'm going to move on, if I may, Professor. In terms of the limitations in data in Northern Ireland at the outset of the pandemic, we've touched on this, but I just, again, to make sure the understanding is clear on the part of the inquiry, there was obviously very limited testing. I think that that's a given, isn't it? Until about mid-March.
Well, you know, testing, there was very limited testing to mid-March. In retrospect, mid-March, right until second year of the pandemic, there was really quite limited testing.
All right.
You know, so test numbers continued to ramp up and were low throughout the first wave.
All right. I'm going to come back and ask you, because I know you obviously played an important part in trying to plan testing in terms of the numbers of people that would be required, for example, for tracing. But I'll come back to that. Just staying with the limited data streams available. There wasn't data available, I think, in terms of hospital admissions until quite a late point as well. Is that right?
So there wasn't reliable data available on hospital admissions until towards the end of April 20.
And I think it's right as well, we've heard about the Apollo system that reported flu symptoms being reported to primary care. But again, is it right that that didn't provide any particular insight into COVID-19 in Northern Ireland either?
So certainly I began to get information from Apollo later in 2020 as one of many data feeds which was supporting our understanding of the progression of the pandemic. But I did not receive that feed early on, certainly not long after my return to work.
So just coming back then to test and tracing, we know, and I don't think I need to bring it up because I'm sure you're familiar with the email. It appears that you made inquiries in April 2020 of the PHA and specifically of the Director of Public Health in Northern Ireland about the number of people who would be required in order to undertake tracing. And I think your statement sets out that that was based on, I think it's a European standard for tracing, is that right?
Well, it was based on my understanding of best international practice in terms of contact tracing, yes.
And we've seen the email to you from the Director of Public Health that appeared to suggest in terms that 500 people were being trained in order to be able to undertake tracing in Northern Ireland. Is that right?
Yes.
And is that what you understood the position to be at that time?
Yes.
And did your understanding about that persist for some time, or did you come to understand that that just wasn't the position?
I did not understand that that was not the position until August, September 20.
And was that the position amongst other senior leaders within the Department of Health as well, that they thought that there was a much greater tracing capacity than in fact existed?
Well, again, that would need to be addressed, I think, to them, but that was certainly my understanding.
I mean, I think we might be able to pick this up. If we could please look at INQ 000 353 671. And I think if we could please go, I think we probably need to go to the last page of this. The penultimate page. And if we could just scroll up, please. Yes, this is the right one. Professor, this was an email from the Director of Public Health. I think it was to Miss Redmond, who we've seen in the Department of Health. And I think we see the suggestion, I think, again, the suggestion had been made that some 500 people would be required. Sorry, 300 to 600 people would be required in order to undertake tracing. We see that in the first paragraph, I apologise, and then reflections.
So if I just go up to the top, first of all, I think that email is to Liz Mitchell rather than Liz
Oh, forgive
Redmond.
me. Yes, I can see that.
So yes, so obviously that is an account of a meeting I had in the middle of September, or attended in the middle of September, where again I reiterated the need for 300 to 600 staff. So I think at that point I had become aware that they had proceeded with a different model for contact tracing rather than the one I had given advice on earlier in the year.
And I think we can see that at the very bottom of that page under reflections, the author's effectively saying that if we were to try and do that, we'd have to double the entire size of the organisation.
And that's correct, but that was the magnitude of the task which I had felt was necessary to have an optimally effective contact tracing service based on best international practice.
And I think if we go up this chain, Professor Young, you may be familiar with this. We see that it's being referred to as Groundhog Day. That's the email from the CMO. And then the reference to the modelling update that had taken place between March and May, when those sorts of figures have been
Yes.
provided, and referring there to the significant incredulity and pushback from PHA, that's what would be required.
So I hadn't been aware of the incredulity and pushback. I had given advice, and certainly that may have been experienced elsewhere in the department, but I hadn't been aware of that.
But anyway, this position, it does appear, had persisted between that much earlier indication in April.
Yes.
That there were not, in fact, 500 staff and this position here. And I think it's right. I don't think I need to take you to this, but there was an article published in the British Medical Journal where representatives of the PHA had said that they had in fact pushed against the idea that you would ever need this number of people to do tracing, and that I think the suggestion was they had never come close to having that number of people trained. Is that right?
So I'm now familiar with that article. Yes, I can't remember when I became familiar with it. I wasn't familiar with it at the time that it was published. I'm not sure that they pushed back, more that they rejected the advice.
Yes.
Rather, I mean, is how I interpreted it. And indeed, PHA colleagues were the experts in terms of contact tracing. I would not have claimed to be an expert in that area.
Well, I think that after you gave your advice in April, this article suggests, and it says in terms, as of the 25th of May, 78 tracers had been fully trained, says Hugo van Voorden, the PHA's Director of Public Health. So a very, very considerable reduction in the number of people who you had suggested needed to be trained.
Yes.
And in terms of, you've said that there was limited testing for quite some time in Northern Ireland. Did that tracing capacity then, presumably it remained quite low for a considerable period of time then during that first year of the pandemic, is that right?
So the testing capacity was low right through the first wave, much, much lower. And if you were to look at the actual number of positive cases, etc., you would see that it was much, much greater later in the pandemic, largely because there was much more testing available and we were identifying a much higher proportion of cases. In the summer of 20, the number of cases became extremely low. Now, I think that was a seasonal effect. And in fact, there were no deaths whatsoever at one stage for 10, 12 days in a row, suggesting
that was in June 2020, wasn't it?
Yes, suggesting that actually the transmission, the prevalence of the virus was very low, and there was probably enough testing capacity at that stage. But as the transmission began to increase from the beginning of August or so onwards and gradually picked up then and became very substantial as we went into autumn, then testing capacity was much more than it had been during wave 1, but not as high as it was during wave 3.
Right.
So we were picking up a proportion of cases. I mean, one of the key learning things for me from the pandemic is the absolute need for much faster rollout of testing, because so many things, so many aspects of our understanding and our response were inhibited by lack of access to testing.
All right. I just want to, that in a way takes us perhaps to one of the most important phases then in the pandemic, which was what happened then after the summer of 2020. And I think I can do this without, if I can try and jog your memory about
Yes.
some of the chronology, but if I alight on anything that you need to see, please do say, Professor Young. I think, as you've said, there was a period in June 2020 when there had been no deaths, and the picture was quite an optimistic one in terms of what had happened. I think it's right, though, that you and the CMO had both said at quite an early stage that it was almost inevitable that there would be a second wave in Northern Ireland. Is that right?
The very first modelling paper I prepared, which was at the beginning of April 20,
Yes.
after I returned to work, said that there would be a second wave.
And it was a question of when rather than if that happened.
It said that there would be a second wave when the restrictions were relaxed.
Yes. And I won't take you through the decision-making process about how to relax restrictions, but I think it's correct that there was a document called the Executive Approach to Decision-Making, which was produced in May 2020, that set out the framework by which the Executive Committee would lift restrictions. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think that you and the CMO advocated an approach of lifting restrictions, waiting to see what the effect was, and then considering whether to lift another restriction. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yes, because in general, every time a policy decision was made, either to relax or to introduce a new set of restrictions, it took 2 to 3 weeks before we could be confident what effect that was going to have. And that was the case throughout the pandemic, and obviously was a source of frustration at times in terms of policy making, which I understood, in that ministers would have liked to know more quickly what the impact of a past decision has made, but it was always between 2 and 3 weeks because of the course of the pandemic.
And I think in terms of the principled approach that was going to be taken, that one of the touchstones, I think there was 5, but one of the touchstones was trying to keep R below 1. Is that right?
That's correct. There was a lot of discussion and explanation of R and what R meant, and ministers committed to and understood that when R was less than 1, that would mean that the pandemic was declining.
Yes.
And when R was above 1, it would mean the pandemic was increasing. Keeping R below 1 was indeed a stated policy position, but not something that was possible, obviously, as the pandemic progressed.
Yes. So I think we'll see that in fact very quickly, I think it's right that R went above 1 in Northern Ireland, and that I think in fact that must have started in August 2020, is that right?
It probably started even before August 20. For a while in July, we stopped reporting R. The reason being that there were so few cases of the pandemic, and obviously I was anxious that ministers and the wider public understood uncertainty around R, and placing a numerical value on it could sometimes be misleading. I mean, there was a point when all I could say is that R was somewhere between 0 and 3 because the number of cases were so low, and that was obviously not helpful information. So we stopped producing R for a while, but I think it was above 1 from some point in July.
And I think it's right that in July, just generally in terms of the pattern of transmission, that it was mostly young people who were driving increasing rates, but that it was understood that that would inevitably lead to a more general rise in rates across the population.
Yes, I think that's correct. School holidays here are the entire months of July and August, and evidence of transmission of the pandemic was low. Young people tended to be less symptomatic. They were mixing probably quite a bit in social settings, understandably, and most of the cases we were seeing were in younger people, but always it was inevitable that that would spread into other segments of the population.
And I'm going to, as it were, ask you about two things in one go, but the inquiry knows obviously that the Eat Out to Help Out scheme was introduced in August 2020, and I think it's right, Professor Young, that it was a UK policy. It was introduced in Northern Ireland without anyone making a decision about it or providing advice about it. Is that correct?
Certainly no scientific or medical advice about it, yes.
And I think that at the same time that it was being introduced, that you and the CMO were advising that there shouldn't be the reopening of pubs that didn't sell food in Northern Ireland. Is that right?
That's correct. The CMO and myself were concerned in early August about the increase in transmission, and I think what we felt was an inevitable autumn wave that was coming, and we expressed concern about additional relaxations that were proposed, in particular the opening of pubs which did not serve food.
If we could just have a look maybe at the advice that you provided at that time. It's INQ 000 353 624. And I think we can probably pick up at the fourth paragraph that by that stage, Professor Young, you thought the R rate was close to 2, is that right?
Yes.
And if we go down just a couple of paragraphs, you pointed out that a delay in reopening pubs, so I think it's right, I jumped ahead slightly, pubs were due to reopen in and around this time.
Yes.
And you point to the fact that there would be dismay in the sector that wasn't going to be the position, but that was a matter for the executive, correct?
Yes, and this comes back, I think, to the broader point that certainly what I was seeking to do all the time was to give advice on the potential implications of decision making and to highlight and to discuss the range of decisions that might be made, but was very clear that while I could easily give advice on the short to medium term impacts of decisions on transmission of the virus, and that I could highlight a range of other issues and concerns, both medical and non-medical, educational, economic, societal, that those could not be quantified in the same way, and that executive had the very difficult task of considering that advice and taking account of that full range of factors in terms of making policy decisions.
Yes, I'll come back to some of the decisions that were made, but just sticking on this document for a moment, I think you were making the point as well in the last paragraph that schools were about to reopen and that keeping schools reopen or making sure that they reopened after the holiday was one of the components of the decision making that had to be fed in at this stage. Is
yes.
that right? In other words, you may not be able to have everything, and that if you want schools to open, that's important.
Certainly one of our lessons was that it was very, very difficult, if not impossible, to have R below 1 hospitality open and schools functioning normally. That seemed to be just a combination which was not compatible with R less than 1 in our experience.
And I think it's right, pubs didn't reopen at this point. Well, they opened a bit later. I think it's in September. I think
yes.
I need to check my notes.
I think so, yeah.
But just coming back to the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, presumably it wasn't helpful to have a scheme that encouraged people to go and socialise or to eat at this point, when, for example, you're trying to discourage people from going to pubs, for example.
So it certainly wasn't helpful in terms of the transmission of the epidemic, I think it probably was very helpful for the restaurant sector in economic terms. So, like so many other decisions, there were pros and cons of it. But from the point of view of its impact on transmission of the epidemic, it was definitely not helpful, although I can't put a number on the extent to which it caused increased transmission.
It should also be pointed out that when I heard evidence in Module 2, the suggestion was that the Eat Out to Help Out scheme was meant to be in a COVID secure, as far as you can be, COVID secure environment.
And that's correct. And I was generally unhappy with the idea of COVID secure environments.
Put it in inverted commas.
I made that point repeatedly with the best will in the world. People eating indoors without face coverings in properties where often ventilation was quite limited. They can't be COVID secure. The idea that they could be was naive.
Thank you, Professor Melody. I don't know if that's a good point to have the break or if that's, I was going to move on, but if you want me to keep going.
No, that's fine. It's slightly early. How are we doing for timing? Basically, how long I generously give you for a break?
I think we're fine for timing.
So if I said 3:30, are you okay for timing?
If we could come back slightly before that.
25 past.
Thank you.
All right. Stop it.
Thank you. Professor Young, just before that short adjournment, I think we had just left the position as it was at in August 2020. And again, I just wanted to pick up the chronology with you, if I may. And again, if you need to go to any documents in order that I can demonstrate any of these dates, then please do say. But I think it's right that in terms of the general picture of the transmission of the virus, the picture it continued to get worse between August and September, is that right?
Yes.
And that ultimately what was advised was that the Executive Committee consider bringing in some localised restrictions. And that was, I think those were brought into place, or that was decided upon on the 10th of December 2020.
I think the 10th of September?
Yes.
Yes, sorry.
Sorry, did I
thought you said December there.
Sorry, I think it was the way I said it, 10th of September 2020. So that was, as I understand it, Professor Young, in recognition of the fact that there were certain localities where transmission rates were particularly high. Is that right?
That's correct, yes. So at that stage, there were marked differences in terms of transmission of the pandemic in different regions of Northern Ireland. And in line with other parts of the UK and Ireland, it was felt that it was worth trying the effect of localised restrictions to reduce transmission, although I think we all recognise that the impacts of that were uncertain and at best would be transient in all likelihood.
Yes. And I mean, I think in Northern Ireland, it was almost, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but it was almost experimental because it hadn't been done before in terms of the effect that it would produce.
I mean, it had been tried in some other parts of the UK and Ireland. It was a trial, yes, to see if it would be effective, and the evidence that we had suggested that there was some benefit, but against the context of a pandemic which was increasing in most other parts of Northern Ireland, at best that was going to be that was a transient effect.
So, and I think it's right just to record that at that point in time, I think it's right that you and the CMO were very concerned about the picture of transmission as it was at that point.
Yes, we were flagging up concerns about the trajectory of the pandemic and recognising that we were in an exponential growth phase, as people sometimes talk about. So during such a phase particularly, once you get to higher levels of transmission, you get an very rapid increase in absolute pressures in the system due to short doubling times.
And I think that was the advice that you were effectively providing at that time, wasn't it? That the picture
Yes.
was a serious one for Northern Ireland.
Yes, certainly I think we were providing that advice, yes.
And in terms of the broader advice that's being provided, I think it's right that on the 21st of September, SAGE then also advised that there may need to be a number of measures at least contemplated at that point in time, and one of those measures was a circuit breaker. Is that right?
Yes, there was an important SAGE meeting on the 21st of September, and that advice was very rapidly escalated by us through to the Northern Ireland Executive, I think later that week.
And in terms of when that became pressing, or when that was then discussed by the Executive Committee, I think it's right, but please correct me if I'm wrong, that was then put to ministers or considered on the 8th of October. Does that correspond with your memory?
So I would have to see that. I think that advice was discussed at earlier executive meetings than that, but that there may have been specific recommendations put on the 8th of October. But from memory, I think the advice was conveyed to the executive without specific recommendations coming out of it at earlier meetings.
All right. I think we have it at paragraph 422 of your statement. I didn't think we need to go to it, but I think
I'm not sure my statement goes to 422.
No, I was just, as soon as I said it, I was thinking that's not right. I think it's the CMO statement deals with it at paragraph 422. But let me just check that you agree with him. And what he says was, at that time it was our view that realistically a circuit breaker or a lockdown was needed. Does that correspond with your recollection at that time?
Yes, it does, that we definitely felt that a circuit breaker or lockdown was needed by the 8th of October. Yes, definitely.
And I think maybe I'll bring this up on screen so that I can remind you of it. It's INQ 000 065 756, please. And I think it's page 7. And perhaps if we just look at page 1, just so that I can demonstrate the date to you, Professor Young. So that is the meeting that took place on the 8th of October 2020 of the Executive Committee. And I think it's right that you attended this meeting in order to address the Executive Committee.
Yes.
And again, what was that to convey to them how serious the position was and the point that had been reached?
Yes, it was. At that stage, I was attending most, if not all, executive meetings and providing regular updates in terms of the situation. So at earlier executive meetings than that, I was telling them it was a serious situation. But by the 8th of October, I think we'd reached the point where there was a realistic danger of the healthcare system becoming overwhelmed if there was not a rapid intervention.
Yes, I'm not putting this to you on the basis that this was late in the day. It's really just to try and understand what the position that had been reached by the 8th of October.
Can I just interrupt for a second? Professor, there are those who question the need ever to have a lockdown. Would you like to explain why earlier in the year and now again in the autumn you felt that a lockdown was inevitable?
So ultimately, our pathway out of the pandemic, and we said this from a very early stage in other documents which you will have access to, required us to achieve a high level of population immunity, preferably through vaccination, but also as a result of natural exposure to the virus. At that stage, vaccination was still a number of months away, and there were not really any very effective treatments in terms of antivirals or other interventions to reduce the risk of of death. So our concern was that the hospital system in particular would become overwhelmed by very ill patients who would mainly be older patients with COVID, and that would lead to a very large number of deaths over a short period of time. The only way to avoid that was to greatly lower the level of transmission of the virus in the community. At that stage, it was clear to us that that required R to be below 1, and furthermore, to attain a fairly rapid fall off in transmission, it needed to be as far below 1 as possible. Now, the best we ever achieved in terms of R was around 0.7, perhaps slightly below, and that was with what came to be known as full lockdown. So it required people essentially to stay at home, to minimise their contacts, for everything other than essential retail to be closed, and for schools to be off. And we'd reached this point in October when we felt we really needed to get R down to 0.7. I think I was showing that on I'm showing as saying that in a later page of this statement. And the only way to achieve that was full lockdown for a period.
Full lockdown, of course, has enormous other consequences.
Yes, it does. And we absolutely highlighted those consequences and highlighted the alternatives, that schools could be kept open, for example, in which case R would be about 0.9. What would the implications of that be? Well, a rather slower fall off in transmission of the epidemic. So fairly high persistent levels of transmission, high hospital pressures through the autumn period. And alternatively, you could have closed schools and you could have opened hospitality, I think, and you would have had something around the same result based on our modelling and understanding. So our R might have been a little bit below 1. And again, we described that as a possible course of action to try to address economic consequences or educational consequences. There were all the broader ones in terms of societal consequences, which we continue to highlight. You know, loneliness, challenge, mental health disturbances, people gaining weight, people drinking too much, all of those other consequences of severe restrictions, which we couldn't easily quantify, but which needed to be considered in qualitative terms by ministers who were trying to reach enormously difficult decisions. You know, the easiest thing in the world would have been to stop transmission of the virus by having an indefinite complete lockdown until such time as we could roll out vaccination. But that was clearly not something that was ever feasible in terms of the indirect costs of the restrictions, because in many ways the restrictions were as damaging as the pandemic itself, and always ministers were trying to balance the harms of allowing transmission with the harms of the restrictions.
I think we'll come back to, and the chair has perhaps foreseen what I was going to ask.
I'm sorry.
No, not at all, because I think, in fact, it's right that the lockdown that was, we'll see the lockdown that was brought in fact, didn't involve the closure of schools. Children, I think there was a 2-week extended
I think there were 2 weeks,
half-term.
yes, 2 weeks of half-term for children and then 2 weeks back, yes.
I think it's, so at this point, it's just trying to understand the dynamic, as it were, because I think it's right if we go, please, to page 7 of this. I think we understand, it helps to understand perhaps the counter views that were being pressed at this point in time. Now, these are handwritten notes. This isn't an agreed minute or anything like that, but perhaps it gives us some idea. But the idea that you were looking for a damaging approach, I think we see as well on this page as well that this particular minister was saying that there was, that I think you and the CMO perhaps were afraid to say where the problem is. I'll ask you about that in a separate question. But I think we start to see here perhaps the suggestion that rather than you advising that you're, I think we can see here the words are looking for a damaging approach as opposed to just advising that this is what we think as the experts might be required.
And I think if you go on to look further in those handwritten notes, which you're right are not an agreed minute,
Yes.
I think the Minister of Health is quoted as saying CSA is not looking for anything.
Yes.
He's giving advice on the impacts of a range of possible interventions and outcomes, which is exactly what I was doing. And I understood that that some ministers were unhappy with the information they were receiving. And there was certainly plenty of robust discussion, which I thought was entirely appropriate in terms of the science being questioned, to which I did my best to respond and provide additional explanations. But always, I think that I sought to provide, and I think the minutes will support this, advice on a wide range of options, including the benefits in terms of reducing transmission, but also highlighting the areas where they would be harms in terms of the interventions. And those were always in, I think, both the mind of myself and the CMO when we gave advice. So, no, I would say I was not looking for any approach.
Yes.
I was advising ministers on
Yes,
implications.
so I didn't mean to cut across you. It was certainly by no means an allegation that you were overstepping the mark. I think the question was about how your advice was perceived. And I think, as you rightly say, the health minister had to step in to say that you weren't there to tell ministers what to do. You were there as in an advisory capacity, and that they mustn't, as it were, take your advice in that way.
Yes, and that was entirely appropriate, and certainly something I agreed with. Yeah.
And just in terms of what position had been reached here, there had been those local lockdowns. I think, in fact, pubs had reopened as well on the 23rd of September. I have a note of that if you need to see it, if you're happy to take it from me.
I'm happy to take it from you, but can't confirm it. But
Yes.
I mean, it sounds very reasonable to me. Yes.
I'm looking at a TEO document that tells me that, so I think it's probably reliable. And schools were back as well. So there were a number of things going on in the epidemiological mix at this stage, I think. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And I don't think there was a decision on the 8th of October to do anything in particular. But I think it's right that, and we've certainly seen within a few days of this, a note of a meeting at which the CMO was expressing the concern that Northern Ireland was probably about 10 days away from having its health services overwhelmed. Is that something that you recollect at that point in time?
Yeah, so from memory, and again, I don't have it in front of me, I think that following that meeting on the 8th, there were exchanges over the weekend where we emphasised the fact that we were very close to reaching the point where the hospital system could be overwhelmed, and discussion about the possibility of another executive meeting early the following week, around the 10th or 11th of October. And I think that's right. The modelling was suggesting around 10 days. And of course, I indicated earlier that any intervention took around 10 days to have an impact. So it was becoming acute in terms of the need, if the priority was to prevent the hospital system from going beyond strain.
And just to pick up, on the point that was made in the meeting, the idea that you and the CMO were afraid to say where the problem was. I think there was some suggestion by the same minister, and it was made in public, that transmission rates were higher in areas that were of a particular political background. Is that correct?
Yes, from recollection, the Minister suggested that transmission rates were higher in areas which would have been perceived as predominantly nationalist in terms of their background and makeup.
And I think it's right that the Chief Medical Officer had to make a public statement addressing that and saying that there wasn't a basis, there wasn't an epidemiological basis for saying that that was the position.
And I recall being asked about it in more than one media interview and saying that it had never been an analysis or comparison that we had done, nor would I think it appropriate to do in terms of our response to the pandemic.
And I think it is right, and this is based on reading across a number of papers, that it was recognised in Northern Ireland that transmission rates could be higher in some areas of greater deprivation than others. Is that correct?
Yes. So the epidemiology within Northern Ireland, as you would expect, was relatively complex, but definitely, as elsewhere, we saw higher levels of transmission in areas with greater socioeconomic deprivation. We also, at certain points in the pandemic, observed a much higher incidence of transmission in the counties of Northern Ireland bordering the Republic of Ireland. And a lot of work was done in those regions on a cross-border basis by the public health authorities to try to use coordinated messaging and risk management approaches to address that problem.
So just coming back to the chronology in terms of what happened next, after that meeting where there was concern about services being overwhelmed, it is right, isn't it? There was another executive committee meeting at which it was recommended or advised that there be a 6-week period of lockdown across the whole of Northern Ireland. Is that right?
So that's correct, and that was based on the current position in terms of transmission of the epidemic and modelling in order to give the maximum chance of avoiding the need for further intervention in the pre-Christmas period. And again, a range of different modelling was presented showing the effects of having a period of strong NPIs for anywhere between 3 weeks and 6 weeks so that the executive could consider the range of options. But yes, we felt that from the point of view of short to medium term consequences of the pandemic, a 6-week intervention would be indicated.
I'm not going to take you to the notes of that minute, but I think we can see that, well, certainly it appears on the face of it, that there was robust pushback on the part of some ministers at least in terms of the advice that you were providing. Is that correct?
I think that there was, as I've said, at times extremely robust pushback to myself and the CMO by ministers as they, looked to probe the advice that we were providing. And because the advice was science and evidence based, then we continued to give the advice and provide explanations for it, while stressing the fact that how the advice fed into a policy decision was a matter for ministers.
Yes, so I think we see in the notes of that meeting, for example, one minister saying there's no science, just assumptions, and I'm sick of assumptions. So it was obviously being put in a more critical, perhaps even than just robust. Is that right?
It was very robust. At times, the criticism and the conversation, but as I say, it did not alter in any way the advice which I was giving or my analysis of the situation.
And I think that your advice at that point in time wasn't taken because the decision was to have a 4-week lockdown rather than the advised 6 weeks. Is that right?
I think the decision was taken to have a 4-week lockdown. I think that was with 2 weeks schools open and 2 weeks schools closed. So it was rather less than the lockdown which had been used in wave 1. I didn't feel at the time that my advice wasn't being taken. I felt that by the majority of ministers, the advice had been understood, received and accepted, and that ministers had appropriately factored in a range of other considerations around education, economy, society and family life, and taking account of the broad range of factors, had decided to go with the 4-week intervention that we have described. So I mean, I didn't feel my advice was rejected. I thought it was understood.
All right. But the fact that it was 4 weeks obviously meant that the decision had to come back, didn't it, to the executive committee then we know it came back on the 9th of November for the first time, but that 4-week period was going to end on the 12th of November.
Yes.
And I think by that stage, schools were back, and the question was whether or not to continue this almost lockdown, but with children still going to school for another 2-week period.
Yes.
And were you at that meeting that took place on
between the 9th and the 12th of November? Yes, I was at all parts of it, I think, yes.
All right, but I think it's right. I'm not going to go back to the papers that had been produced in advance of that meeting, but I think it's right that, broadly speaking, the advice that you were given was that if this almost lockdown wasn't extended, that case numbers were they might arrest for a short period, but they were going to go up again thereafter. And that hospital numbers were at quite a high base rate and weren't going to decline either.
I think that's correct. That was the advice, and we were very concerned about hospital numbers at that time, and in particular for the possibility of much higher numbers in hospitals in the post-Christmas period.
So I think what initially happened then, just picking up the decision-making process, that the recommendation made by you and the CMO, and I think it was the recommendation for a 2-week extension, I think it's right that was that initially defeated, as it were, on a vote by the committee?
So it was a long and complex meeting in multiple parts, and there were, from recollection, a couple of votes on different proposals. But yes, the initial proposal from the Health Minister, rather than based on advice from CMO and myself, my recollection is that was defeated fairly early on in that 9th to 12th week process.
And it's right, isn't it, that was a vote that was taken on a cross-community basis as well?
Yes, I recall that was a vote taken on a cross-community basis, yes.
And in terms of, and it may be that it's best that I asked you about this from a principled point of view, the idea that a public health measure should be voted on on a cross-community basis, was that of concern to you as a public health, as a scientific advisor to the executive committee?
I mean, as you will be very aware, the politics of Northern Ireland are complicated, and there are firm rules in place around cross-community votes and how they work. I'm not an expert on that. I recall discussion and seeming agreement that it was appropriate, at least in technical terms, for such a vote to be taken, and due process was followed. I thought it was unfortunate in terms of public perception, particularly given the ongoing discussion of events at executive meetings. I didn't think it was helpful in terms of public confidence.
I wonder if it's a little bit more than just a perception of public confidence, though, that as a matter of principle, the idea that a health measure should be voted on that sort of basis whether that, and again, I ask you it as a question of principle, whether or not that was a matter of concern.
So you'll appreciate maybe that I would prefer, not to comment on that. I think it was unfortunate. I think it was not helpful in terms of public perception and confidence in terms of decision making. The evidence would suggest that consistent public messaging is important to maintaining confidence and helping with adherence to regulations. And I felt in that context it was not helpful. Beyond that, I can't really say anything.
All right, thank you, Professor Young. Obviously this meeting carried on over the course of a number of days, and I think, again, I won't take you to the papers on it, but there were a series of ministerial papers, weren't there, suggesting other courses that might be taken in opposition to having or to taking your advice. Is that right?
Well, I think all of the papers took account of our advice, and I wouldn't want to say otherwise. Okay. And we provided advice, I think, in relation to almost all of the proposals that were brought forward when asked to do so. I do recall, yes, that there were a series of votes and proposals during the course of that week before eventually a decision was made, yes.
I think, one of the papers that Minister Long brought forward was effectively to try and broker a compromise, is that right, between different ministers? And I think she suggested that there be a week extension rather than 2 weeks.
So there were a number of papers which brought forward different proposals from different ministers. I can't really comment on whether individual ministers were seeking to find a compromise or not. Certainly I recall Minister Long brought a paper forward and we commented on that in terms of advice around the likely implications of following those recommendations.
And I think it's right that during this there was the generation of further papers, and we can ask Minister Swan about this, but effectively addressing why some of the suggestions would nonetheless wouldn't protect, for example, the health services in Northern Ireland, or wouldn't provide a wholesale answer to the concerns that you had.
Yeah, I can remember that the various papers differed, sometimes in quite small ways, sometimes in slightly more substantial ways in terms of what was being suggested. I think we reached a point where we said, well, look, in terms of advice, we can just say this would be a little worse, this would be a little better. We can't possibly model in any meaningful sense what the difference between this paper and the last paper would be. But overall, the potential outcome in terms of short to medium term transmission of the epidemic would look like this. And certainly there were a number of different versions and a lot of intense discussion about them. Yeah.
And I think there was then another cross-community vote as well, wasn't there? There were 2 across this period.
Yeah, I recall a second cross-community vote, yes.
I won't ask you about that, but presumably your position is precisely the same about that one, that it wasn't helpful to public perception and confidence.
Well, I think that's what the evidence would suggest, that clear and consistent messaging and decision-making is important to public confidence and adherence to behaviours.
And I think that the net result of all of this, Professor Young, was that there was a 1-week extension of the restrictions that were in place, and again with children attending school. Is that right?
Yes, that's my recollection, yes.
And that meant that this issue came back before the Executive Committee once again a week later for further decision making about what to do.
As we had advised that it would probably need to come back, yes.
And I think perhaps we can just have a look at the advice, because what was plainly an issue then was what impact that period of restrictions had. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think, is it right, and I think we can trace this through a number of your papers, that those restrictions hadn't had the impact that you hoped they would have?
So I'm aware of a comment, I think in handwritten notes to that effect. I think looking back we had observed R falling to around 0.7 during the first lockdown, when there was a very high level of adherence and compliance to the restrictions in place. I think while schools were closed, we observed R falling to a little bit less than 0.8. So, and indeed, evidence suggested that adherence to the restrictions was not as good as it had been in the first lockdown. So, in some, that was probably unsurprising. And then with schools open again, R rose further and was probably not very far below 1. So, certainly, if the intention had been to try to reduce R to 0.7 to 0.8, it was unsuccessful. R had been a bit higher than that.
All right, and just in terms of just picking up where this left things then, I think we come back to the 19th of November, and I think the concern remained at this point that health services were still at risk of being overwhelmed. Is that right?
So throughout that period, and I think we saw it from deaths earlier, but you'd have seen something very similar in terms of hospital pressures. We were really sitting at a very high plateau, going up and down a little bit. In order for those pressures to be reduced, it needed a sustained reduction in R, preferably close to 0.7 for 4 to 6 weeks, which is what we had originally suggested. We'd failed to achieve that, and therefore the hospital pressures remained really very high.
And I think it's right, although I can take you to a paper to demonstrate this, that the effect of the way the decisions was made meant that when it got to after that 19th of November, the restrictions that had been in place lapsed, and there was then a week's period where non-essential retail reopened.
So I think that is correct, but I would need to go.
I'll take you
back
to a
the
document.
paper.
Yes, I don't, because I think it's important we get this right. I think if we are able to, please, it's INQ 0004 22247. And I think if we look at page 3, please. So I think if we...
So the third line down, comments to cafes and non-essential retail being open this week, if
exactly.
that's the
yes,
that's
that
the
was
point.
what I was looking for.
Right.
And I will see this traced, the impact of that, I think, traced into other, to the other data that you then went on to consider. So that, I think, was on the 23rd of November, Professor Young. And I think if we could then just, it may help us. It may not be possible to go to this, but if we can, it may help. INQ 0003 304288. We may not have that, Professor. I'm just looking. 1 second, apparently. Okay. So I think this is a meeting note, and I think on page 2, on the 4th point, so yes, sorry, it's your advice or the what you said. We just say it under Deputy First Minister.
Yes.
So I think we do see recorded here that there was nowhere near what had been achieved with the stay-at-home message in wave 1. still scope to open up after 11th. I think still making the point about not able to have everything open at once. And I think thank you. And I'll just pick up the thread then, if I may, on with INQ 000286272.
So just a brief
Yes.
comment on that. You'll also note that I had not seen any of these prior to the inquiry. And again, can't comment on the accuracy of the note that has been made.
Of course. Sorry, Professor Young. And just to be clear, I think when you said there was a handwritten note about the stay-at-home message not being,
Yes.
not having gotten through, I
Yes.
think there may be, and I think we also see it in this note as well.
Yes.
And I think if we can go to the other document. So this is the 8th of December. And I think if we can, I'm just looking to see where it says this, it may be over the page. Yes, so this was the point that I wanted to pick up. So in terms of the impact of that 1 week, what appears to have been a relaxation in measures, it does appear that that was then translating into an increase in cases at this particular time. And it was that I wanted to ask you about. I don't know if that's jogged your memory about that it...
No, I think that's correct. I mean, that's what we observed at the time in terms of the data. And I think testing was relatively constant at that stage from memory. So case numbers always have to be interpreted in the light of any changes in testing which might have taken place. For example, when it came to Christmas, we saw for 2 or 3 days a big drop in the number of cases. That was just because people weren't getting tested.
Yes.
So, you've always got to take account of testing, but I think it was fairly constant at this stage, so that 1 week of relaxation did have that effect.
And I think I won't go through all of the documents that I think show us this, but I can, Professor Young, if you do want to see it. But we saw it in the graph that we looked at the very outset, that notwithstanding the steps that had been taken, the 4-week lockdown extended by a week, that nonetheless the rates continued on an upward trajectory at that point in time.
So I think that rates came down a little bit during the 4 weeks plus 1 week.
Yes.
But because R didn't get down anywhere close to 0.7, then the drop-off in transmission was less than it could have been in ideal circumstances. And we then saw an upward trajectory, yes, in the run-up to Christmas, as behaviours began to alter and there were further relaxations, as indeed is reflected in what we expected to happen in the notes of various meetings leading up to that.
Yes. So, and obviously at this point in time, we know that there were also the discussions about Christmas time as well. And,
yes.
And I think the way that it was put in Northern Ireland was protecting Christmas. That may have been used in other places as well, but I think we see that in some of the papers.
There was certainly a desire at the end of what had been an extraordinarily difficult year to allow people some degree of mixing, and if not normality, at least interaction around the Christmas period. Our advice emphasised the difficulty that we would have in terms of predicting the impact of that, but that it was overwhelmingly likely to lead to a significant increase in virus transmission. We were particularly concerned about the likelihood of mixing between younger people and older individuals over the Christmas period who would be at more risk. In addition, traditionally, very large numbers of young people in particular return to Northern Ireland from universities in the run-up to Christmas. And we were also concerned about additional introduction or seeding events as a consequence of people coming back into Northern Ireland. So it was a complex situation, difficult to predict, but we knew that it would lead to problems after Christmas.
And just in terms of trying to understand why, notwithstanding the steps that had been taken in terms of having that 4-week lockdown, then an extra week. I know there was that period in between, and then I think there's another 2-week set of restrictions. Sorry, just to finish the question, It's really to try and understand why, notwithstanding the fact that there were certainly for points during that period some quite severe restrictions, that nonetheless we see the second wave take the shape that it does.
So there's a document which went to SAGE, of which I was one of the co-authors, and its number is INQ 000396813, which compares the autumn interventions in the 4 countries of the UK. It's a scientific analysis, and it runs with the interventions up to about the middle or end of November, so significant amount of the period that we're covering. What it shows is that the decisions and interventions made in Northern Ireland were the most effective of the interventions in any of the 4 nations of the UK, very clearly the most effective. So I think that the decisions which were made were effective, but not as effective as perhaps we would have needed them to be. And some of that relates probably to the timing of the interventions as well as the nature of the interventions. I think the interventions were effective, but always, as we said at that time, earlier intervention is better than later intervention. And earlier interventions of that kind at a lower point on the epidemiological curve probably would have had greater benefit. But I think the evidence and analysis suggests that the interventions in Northern Ireland were good interventions and, to say, more effective than those in England, Scotland or Wales.
I want to unpick, if I may, some of that. And first of all, without comparing to the rest of the UK, just understanding what happened in Northern Ireland, because as we've seen, the picture of the second wave obviously demonstrates a larger number of deaths over a greater period of time, correct?
Than in
wave one.
Than in wave one, yes. Yes.
And we've seen from the evidence that there was clearly concern in wave 2, and we've seen it. You have the concern at the time that the stay-at-home message wasn't working, correct?
It wasn't. But yes, it wasn't working as effectively as it did in wave 1. Yes.
Of course. So one can assume that. Well, perhaps one can't assume, Professor Young. Let me ask you whether or not the concerns about public confidence, for example, around decision-making might be borne out in terms of people not adhering to measures in the way that they had done in wave 1.
And this is an opinion rather than borne out by evidence, okay? My opinion was that during wave 1, there was a very acute level of worry and concern about the implications of the pandemic, and that resulted in a very, very high level of adherence among the general population to messaging. And messaging was clear and consistent, and I'm not aware of any significant departures from that in Northern Ireland during wave 1. By the time we reached the autumn of wave 2, there had been time for a lot more critical opinion to emerge, and that included less consistent messaging, probably, from people in positions of influence. You've highlighted politicians at some stage, but there were also other influencers, if I can use that term, people with constituencies and audiences, some scientific, some general members of the public, popular in other spheres, who were expressing significant reservations about a range of the responses to the pandemic, whether it be wearing face coverings or the need for social distancing or lots of other things. And all of that, I think, fed into less adherence to the messaging, including the stay-at-home message, during the second wave than in the first wave. I don't think observed inconsistency, disagreements among political leaders was helpful in terms of public confidence, but I think that the difficulties and challenges to public confidence had a significantly broader basis than just, for example, decision-making at the executive and how that was portrayed.
But if you're right about the idea that it was just generally becoming more challenging to promote adherence during the second wave, one assumes it wouldn't help having decision makers themselves making public the fact that they were in disagreement.
No, and I've already said that I don't think that was helpful.
Yes, well, I won't press you on that, but can I just go back again to the epidemiological question of the week when restrictions lapsed and there was obviously an increase in people going to shops and all the rest of it. That 25% increase in cases, you said at the outset you would start to see the consequences of that.
Yeah.
A couple of weeks down the line in respect of admissions to hospitals and then a much longer period of time, potentially, if one was looking at the fatality rate, is that correct?
That's correct, yes. I mean, typically around 10 days. Now, it depends a bit where the increase in cases is occurring. If the 25% increase in cases in that week was predominantly in young people, then there would have been very few direct hospital admissions, which would have resulted from that. But still, those young people, by virtue of mixing with older people at home or elsewhere, would have led to increased cases in older segments of the population, and it's that which would have led through, possibly after a slightly further delay, to an increase in hospital admissions with all of the consequences that flew from that, including, unfortunately, deaths.
Okay, forgive me, I didn't want to make it too simplistic, but insofar as one can see then the peak reached in January 2021, in your opinion, was that attributable to the measures that were in place over the Christmas period, or was it a cumulative effect of everything that had happened in the course of December, or something different entirely?
The cumulative effect of what had happened from the end of September meant that we had a very high baseline running into the 2 weeks before Christmas. The observed consequences in January were predominantly a result of the 2 weeks before Christmas.
Thank you, Professor. And I think to square that, if we just go to I think this is the final document, INQ 000 422563. Oh, forgive me, that's the wrong document. It's INQ 000 276571. And paragraph 3, please. So I think we see, in fact, that is essentially the demonstration of the advice that you had been given for some time leading up to that period.
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, And those consequences need to be weighed up with the benefits to the economy and broader society and family relationships of having those relaxations in the pre-Christmas period, yes.
I think, but coming just in terms of the general point, and of
Yes.
course that's a matter of balancing up different considerations, but I think it is right. There's no doubt about the advice that you gave before Christmas was that this would effectively be the outcome.
The modelling which was conducted by my colleagues and myself working with me, to whom I'm very grateful, was in general very good.
Yes.
And, this was in line with what we had suggested would be likely to happen based on our modelling. Unfortunately, close to the upper end of the limits.
That's what I was going to ask you. The modelling did in fact foretell what would happen in terms of that peak in January 2021.
Yes, we were always very keen to say, and I need to repeat it, modelling is not prediction.
Yes.
But in fact, what happened was very much in line with the modelling that was done, yes.
All right. I think, my lady, if I break off there, I think there are some other questions from other core participants.
I think there is a question on which I have given permission a minute ago. Thank you, Ms. Campbell.
Thank you, milady. And we all know the risks of asking a question that you've only just identified, but I'll do my best. Professor Young, I want to revisit with you just briefly the period of September to October 2020. And we're very familiar now with where the peak starts to rise on some of the charts that we've looked at in your evidence this afternoon. But in order to assist you, I wonder if we can look at paragraph 121 of your statement. And 121 deals at the outset with the SAGE meeting of the 21st of September 2020. It'll come up in a moment. Sorry, I should say it would be helpful if I gave a page number. It's page 44. There we are. And the very top paragraph. You were asked about this briefly just after the break this afternoon. And the point that we're interested in, we have the 21st of September SAGE meeting, which, as you've set out, recommends the consideration of a package of measures, including a circuit breaker. Such were the, if you like, the statistics and the modelling at that point in England. Do you recall that portion
Yes.
of your evidence? And you were asked about it in the context of paragraph 422 of the Chief Medical Officer's statement, which in fact correlates almost precisely with your statement at 121. So there is that, if you like, comfort for you. But this statement makes clear that on the 21st of September, we have SAGE recommending consideration of a package of measures, including a circuit breaker, which, as we know, went on to become, if you like, controversial in the context of Northern Ireland. And you say, at that stage, hospital pressures in the Northern Ireland remain relatively modest, and it was not until early October that the Chief Medical Officer and I advised that significant intervention was required. And you did so at the executive meeting of the 8th of October. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, building on your evidence, that really early intervention is better intervention. That's what you've told us this afternoon. The earlier, the better. And to some extent, Northern Ireland had benefited from earlier intervention in March 2020, and we saw that when we look at the graph of wave 1. Here we are in September. The R number is consistently above 1. And on the 21st of September, SAGE is recommending a series of measures, including and up to circuit breakers. Now, the rule still applies, really, for Northern Ireland. Early intervention is better intervention. Isn't that right?
Yes, it applies everywhere, yes.
Now, if it is the case, as you say in your statement here, using your words, it was not until early October that the CMO and you advised that significant intervention was necessary, and you did so at the meeting of the 8th of October, there will have been a period of slippage from the 21st of September until the papers that you exhibit in this statement are drafted the 6th of October, the 7th of October, and the meeting of the 8th of October. Do you see the point?
Yeah, so a couple of comments on that. So first of all, what SAGE recommended on the 21st of September was consideration
Yes.
of the measures. And indeed, the measures were considered. And I think if we look at, and I think from memory, it's the executive meeting of the 24th of September, we tabled SAGE's advice along with discussion of the epidemiological position within Northern Ireland and the current state of play. So all of that information was provided. The timing of interventions, and what I've said and what I agree with is that the earlier the intervention, the more stringent it is, and the longer it lasts, the better. In terms of the transmission of the virus, but that needs to be weighed up against the other considerations around an intervention, including the extent to which it's likely to be accepted by the public, the economic damage, the damage to society, and the educational damage that would result. So the timing of a recommendation coming forward, which came forward from the department, not from myself and the CMO, but it was a recommendation in line with our advice, which came through on the 8th of October. But the information, all of the information from SAGE and about the epidemiology of the pandemic had been very clear to the executive at earlier meetings.
In fact, if we look at the handwritten minutes or the handwritten notes, I should say, and I don't ask for them to be put up, the CMO makes clear in this meeting of the 8th of October that he had never been so concerned as he was until that point. Okay, and maybe that you don't recollect that at this juncture. Certainly, taking him at his word, by the 8th of October, there was a sense of urgency in relation to decisions that needed to have been taken.
Well, I think as we saw earlier in my evidence, both the CMO and I were very keen on an intervention at the meeting on the 8th of October and would have supported it in terms of the short to medium impacts on transmission of the virus. I think that's the meeting where there was quite a lot of pushback, and we'd have to get the minutes up and have a look at it in terms of the damaging nature of the intervention or response which we were asking for. So, there was a degree of urgency. There was a sense that the hospital system would have difficulty coping with the pressures probably in 2 weeks' time. In fact, the pressures became much worse later that autumn and winter than we had even anticipated.
Well, finally, given that urgency was there on the 8th of October, and given that the warnings had been clear at least from the 21st of September at that SAGE meeting, was there a window of opportunity in which earlier intervention in that period of time would have been better intervention for autumn and winter 2020?
I think if you go back to look at the minutes of the SAGE meeting from the 21st of September and the modelling which was presented to SAGE at that time through SPIM, it didn't flag up particular concerns about Northern Ireland, but did flag up considerable concerns about other parts of the UK. So where we were in terms of the epidemic curve was not the same, I think, as it was in parts of Great Britain. But the general concept that the earlier the intervention, the more stringent the intervention and the longer it lasts is better in terms of the short to medium term impacts of virus transmission, that's absolutely true. And it was true then as it was true at other parts of the epidemic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms
Thank
Campbell.
you.
Thank you very much for your help, Professor Young. Very grateful.
Thank you.
I'm not sure whether I can give you any undertakings of not imposing on you again, but thank you for the help so far.
Okay, thank you.
My lady, I was going to let Professor Young go. I think he can be excused, can't he?
Thank you.
My lady, there's a short matter that arises about the witness list for tomorrow. You were due, in fact, to hear a marathon 5 witnesses tomorrow. One of those witnesses has been taken ill. That's Mr. Conor Murphy, who you were due to hear from. I think he has made an announcement himself that he's been advised by his doctor pending some medical tests coming back, and that he has informed the inquiry that he won't be able to attend the hearing tomorrow on medical advice. So, my lady, we will revisit that with you, but certainly for the purposes of tomorrow, he has been stood down.
Okay. I mean, if it ends up that we finish the hearings here and he can't give evidence, is the material that he provides material we can cover in other ways, including obviously his written statement?
Yes, and I think there are other witnesses to whom we could put questions that might help illuminate some of the points he's made.
And I'm sure the core participants will help if they can, if there are any matters they wanted. Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
All rise.